little section here for return and normalcy. We're going to see maybe something a little interesting, so we'll get into this. Now, the idea is going back to these quotas. This is nativism again. Remember, nativism is extreme dislike, or in some cases, hatred towards anyone who does not fit a native mold. And again, that's silly, right? The Native Americans were here and we didn't like them, and so basically anyone who's not WASP, or they're not considered Nordic, they're not considered American. Now, the biggest nativist group who had a rise and Reconstruction and kind of went away came back, and they brought their Casper the Not-So-Friendly Ghost costumes, right? And it is the KKK. So the KKK has a rebirth in the 1920s due to the nativist ideas. Notice they're marching around the Capitol because they love the fact of the Quota Acts and all these things that are happening. To show you what I'm talking about, KKK chapters started sprouting up not just in the South, but actually across the entire country. And they had a massive rally where they actually went from LA to New York City and gathered everybody in the way. Now, what actually helped them out is a movie, and this movie is kind of interesting, I guess, or a book, I guess you consider it, and later becomes a movie. And it is called The Birth of a Nation. They actually portray in this movie the KKK as being patriotic, which is kind of odd and kind of maybe a bit unfounded. But given the fact of nativism, people loved this and they took it in and they started joining the KKK in droves. And so this is what helps. Now, as much as they got big, we need a scandal to drop it down. And so after the scandal, it drops down and it never gets as high as it was at the beginning there. And the man responsible for this scandal is right here. His name is, well, he's called the Grand Dragon, right? Grand Poobah, Wizard, whatever he's considered, right? David Stevenson. And what David Stevenson did is there was a teacher in Illinois who he liked. And so he asked her on a date. She said no. So one night he sent some members of his clan that were responsible to him. They kidnapped her, put him on a train with her. They drugged her. He beat her, he raped her, he killed her. And so ultimately that falls back on them, and people do not want to be associated with the KKK because even though they're portrayed as something in The Birth of a Nation, the reality was they were very, very bad people, and so we want to get away from that. Now what the KKK was actually portraying is that America is for Americans, that Americanization, right? So remember this one, love this. America's for Americans, period. I agree. Why don't you go back to Europe? So Americanization, they want to drop your culture, become American, and maybe that's not necessarily good. Now going away from that and going back towards some stuff on the foreign aspect after World War I. If you remember who was the one that's actually asking for the money here, we expected Germany to pay all these things. So Senator Dawes and later Senator Young come up with a plan. And the whole idea is that the U.S. would lend money to Germany, spent building up the German economy. Germany would increase its tax revenues to pay reparations to France, and France pay back war loans to the United States and imports U.S. goods to help rebuild France. And so we have all those things going on, and this was the Dawes plan. Now the problem is, once we got to here, Germany is in such bad shambles that they're actually burning money to stay warm, and they can't make the payment to France. France actually threatened to come in and invade them through the Alsace-Lorraine, and we had to stop that. So we lost some significant money here, billions of dollars, and that will come back to bite us in the end. Now, a second thing that happened was the Washington Naval Conference. We get together the 9 most powerful navies in the world. Of course, we're number 1, correct? And the whole goal here is to prevent building warships. In the essence here, we saw it as this. We are, we have the 9 people here, and we have common people of the world, and we don't want to be the alligators. Now, I found this funny here because the alligator and the tigers and the hyenas are telling the sheep, we want to control your wool like passions. And this is disarmament conference talk about Washington Naval Conference. It's kind of funny. So the whole purpose of Washington Naval Conference is to kind of tone down the warmongering, going to war. And so at this conference, they actually issue an official moratorium. A moratorium basically is a stop to doing something. in this case, stop building new naval boats with bigger guns and higher caliber weapons, etc., so that we can stop doing this. Now, there are a series of treaties here, the 4-power and the 5-power treaty, which you'll have to look up for your objective. But I do want to talk a little bit about the 9-power treaty. Now, the 9-power treaty has to do with the country where we have the open door policy. If you remember, that is China, okay? So we basically said we're going to stay out of China and let them have territorial integrity. The problem there is that China in a few years will become involved in a terrible civil war in which they will fall to communism in the 1950s. But we basically said we're going to stay out of it, and for the most part we did. We did provide some weapons, things like that, training to Chiang Kai-shek, but we will talk about that in World War II, right? So 9-power treaty has to do with China. Now, we basically agreed, let bygones be bygones. Now, the last treaty we need to talk about is called the Kellogg-Briand Pact. This is 19 countries from across the world, and we basically sign a pact that, for lack of a better term, and I'm sorry if I'm not creative, or you can, or whatever you want to, I call it the war is bad, okay? War is bad, okay? Let's not go to war. We don't want to go back to war. You can see Mr. Mackey in that case. But the general idea was to never use war to solve a political dispute. Now, this is maybe a bit of foreshadowing, but there is a country who breaks this very, very vividly, all these treaties, if you will, and it's Japan. They violate the 9-power treaty in China, they violate the Kellogg-Briand Pact, they violate the League of Nations Covenant, the Shanghai Port Treaty, the World Court, all of these things when they start up their militarist push prior to World War II. Now, the objectives you need to make sure that you've got here: explain how Harding's Ohio gang hurt his presidential legacy, describe how a conservative president executes his office, tell us about certain things they do and don't do, explain how nativism was more important than evidence in Sacco and Vanzetti, compare Birth of a Nation myths with David Stevenson. What were they telling people about the KKK and what was actually happening? And then lastly, you're going to, as I said, have to go look up the 4 and the 5. List and explain the many treaties of Washington Naval Conference. That'd be the 4-power, the 5-power, the 9-power, and then the Kellogg Pact, and tell me what is going on there. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about is more at home in the 1920s, and it's the clash of traditional versus modernism. We have a clash of values, and everything begins to change in the 1920s.